Coretta, the Autobiography of Mrs. Coretta Scott King. Written by Coretta Scott King with the Reverend Dr. Barbara Reynolds, illustrated by Ekua Holmes. Was born on April 27th, 1927, in Heiberger, Alabama, at a time and in a place where everything I would eventually become was impossible even to imagine. Who could have dreamed that a little girl who at age 10 hired herself out with her sister to pick cotton for $2 a week in the piercing hot sun would rise to a position that allowed her to help pick US mayors, congresspersons, or even presidents? That I would be able to help build a human rights movement while also raising 4 beautiful children? Most of my childhood was happy. Church was the center of my social life. My parents provided a nurturing environment, and I had siblings I adored. Edith was the bookworm. Obie was the fixer who could repair anything. I was the doer, a workaholic always looking for a project. As children, we didn't have money for store-bought games or toys, so we fashioned our own. One of our favorite pastimes was swinging. There were other things we wanted to do, but we had to accept that we just could not do them. There were no recreation facilities for Black children. A day came when I had to ask my mother the same questions every Black child asked sooner or later. Why am I treated differently? Why do whites hate us so? My mother answered in much the same way Black mothers have answered for generations. You are just as good as anyone else, she said. You get an education, then you won't have to be kicked around. Mother figured out a way to send me to Lincoln Normal School, a semi-private high school where the faculty was mixed, half white, half Black, and most were from the North. In the summer of 1943, my older sister Edith became, for a time, the only Black student at Antioch College. I too applied and was accepted in 1945. And so it was that one of my mother's lifelong dreams for me, as well as my own, was coming true. I was going to college. At Antioch, I expanded the worldview I'd begun to develop at Lincoln. Nurtured by this diverse, pro-peace environment, I began to dream of a world in which all kinds of people could be welcome and could live in peace and harmony. This is not to say that there were not some bumps and bruises along the way, but the hard knocks prepare one for leadership as much as the soft landings. Racism challenged me in my degree path. I was the first Black person to major in elementary education at Antioch with a minor in voice. Because there were no Black teachers in the Yellow Springs, Ohio public school system, I was deprived of my right to teach there. I appealed to the local school board and tried to rally the students to my cause, and I appealed to Antioch College's administration. This was the first time I stood up publicly against discrimination, and the experience only deepened my resolve to continue the struggle Blacks have always fought, which was for inclusion and respect. After Antioch, I received an early acceptance to the New England Conservatory and decided to go there. I was settled into what I thought would be my life's work, thriving and happy. When one afternoon in my second semester at the conservatory, I got a call from my classmate, Mary Powell. Coretta, she said, have you heard of Martin Luther King, Jr.? Soon after I spoke with Mary, Martin called and introduced himself. As we talked about our different schools over lunch, I felt his stare. I found him easy to talk to, and we chatted about everything from questions of war and peace to racial and economic justice. As he was driving me home, we stopped at a light, and he turned to me. You have everything I have ever wanted in a wife. When can I see you again? As our courtship continued, we talked at length about values, morals, and philosophy, and it was clear on all the important things that Martin and I basically agreed. The other issues we felt could be worked out. I still resisted a relationship, harboring nagging concerns about what would happen to my own sense of mission if I married. But I realized I had begun to fall in love with him. 1 year and 4 months after we met, on June 18th, 1953, Daddy King married Martin and me on the lawn of my parents' home in Marion, the one that they had built to replace the house that was burned to the ground by white racists when I was 15 years old. I had made up my mind that I wanted the traditional language about obeying and submitting to my husband deleted from our marriage vows. Neither Daddy King nor Martin objected. "60 days after the Montgomery bus boycott began, on the evening of January 30th, 1956, in the little house where we lived in Montgomery, Alabama, I was in a happy mood. My infant daughter, Yolanda, we called her Yoki, was asleep in her crib in the back room. Suddenly, coming from the front porch, I heard a sound, a heavy thump, and a rolling noise. Before we could get halfway through the next room, a bomb exploded on the porch. The noise frightened my baby, who awoke, crying. I ran and gathered him in my arms. I gasped, calling out, "Oh, my Lord," as I saw the damage the bomb had unleashed. Since the Montgomery bus boycott had begun 2 months before, we had experienced a barrage of harassing phone calls. Martin had an understanding of the Christian Gandhian principles of nonviolence. "We must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us," he said. It took a lot for me to stand my ground as well. On November 13th, 1956, the Supreme Court declared Alabama state and local laws requiring segregation on buses unconstitutional. This was a landmark verdict. After 381 days of determined protest, we could once again ride city buses. And for the first time since almost anyone could remember, we could sit where we wanted to and ride with dignity. It's hard to describe the emotions, exhilaration, pride, hope that washed over us all as we boarded that bus. Violence and oppression take many forms, and the form that took its toll on me was Martin's repeated, unwarranted arrests. I felt so alone and vulnerable. Moreover, it was left to me to help our small children counter the teasing from other children who said their daddy was a jailbird. I felt it was important for them to see his jail going as a badge of honor. While the sit-ins and protests were taking new forms, my life also was taking a new shape. More and more, I served as a public speaker when Martin asked me to stand in for him. I also performed, giving concerts to raise money for the movement, and I continued my role as a spokeswoman for the peace movement that I had begun. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was set for August 28, 1963. Although no woman was allowed a prominent speaking role, Mahalia Jackson sang. Then the moment so many had come so far to experience arrived. From one side of the Lincoln Memorial to another, people began chanting Martin's name. As he spoke, it seemed to me like heaven itself had opened up and poured out visions of hope. I sat awed by the magnificence of the occasion. Years later, in March 1968, Martin agreed to lead a protest march for a sanitation worker strike in Memphis. Violence had broken out. Martin felt he had no choice but to return to Memphis and lead another march to prove the efficacy of nonviolence. When he left Atlanta on April 3rd, I followed Martin to the door, kissed him goodbye, and wished him well. The children were still asleep and didn't see him leave. It was an ordinary farewell, like thousands of others. The next evening, on April 4th, Jesse Jackson called. "Doc has been shot." I kissed the children goodbye and headed to the airport. As soon as we got there, I heard a page over the public address system. It was for me. I knew Martin was dead. Calls were pouring in, offering help and condolences, but nothing anyone could have said or done would have eased the sorrow welling in my heart. I made a statement saying that nothing could hurt Martin more than those who he left behind to solve their problems with violence. I would finish what Martin and the movement started. I decided to continue with the march in Memphis. There, I spoke without notes from the heart. I challenged the crowds to see that Martin's spirit never dies and that we will go forward from this experience. Back in Atlanta, the funeral service was so beautiful. When we came out of the church and into the sunlight, we saw tens of thousands of people standing in the streets. Together, we began our march from Ebenezer Baptist Church to Morehouse College for the memorial service. We marched because Martin had spent so much of his life marching for justice and freedom. In the months immediately following Martin's death, thousands of requests poured in from all over the world. This rush of international invitations was a humbling reminder that our mission was respected on a global stage. I had to reflect seriously on what course I would take as an activist working to shape public policy. Through 12 and a half short years of ministry, Martin changed the world we lived in. I wanted to ensure that his legacy to humanity lived on. So on June 26, 1968, I founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Center and later renamed it the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, or the King Center. The center would advocate not just for civil rights, but for human rights. I'd always seen the work we were doing in the movement as a part of a global human rights struggle. In 1977, when President Jimmy Carter appointed me a public delegate to the United Nations, it allowed me to expand the message of nonviolence and human rights. I spoke out about the value of treating every life with human dignity and respect. Later, I made a strong stand for gay rights. I championed ending apartheid in South Africa. In 1992, the King Center became directly involved in South Africa in advance of that nation's first truly democratic national elections. The US State Department gave the center a grant to create a curriculum and to train South African activists in the principles of Martin's nonviolent philosophy. Our staff, working alongside South African activists, were armed with little more than their Bibles and their faith that a peaceful transition was not only necessary, but achievable. We helped train more than 300,000 people. In 1994, Nelson Mandela made the transition from 27 years of imprisonment to his role as leader of his nation, all without massive bloodshed. I can be a very determined woman. Perhaps nowhere has this been more obvious than in my efforts to establish Martin's birthday as a national holiday. In 1983, after 15 years of lobbying, 9 million petition signatures, hundreds of thousands of marching feet, telegrams from around the world, and outreach from President Jimmy Carter and Pope John Paul II, the Martin Luther King Jr. birthday holiday was finally a federal law. I have lived a life beyond anything I ever imagined or thought possible for a child born in nowhere, USA, into a race that was virtually disqualified from humanity and a gender condemned to silence. I have known great triumphs, and along my journey, I have found answers to the questions I often pondered when I was that little girl in Alabama. Who will I be? What is my purpose? I want people to know that I was committed to leaving an eternal flame built on love that would never be extinguished. Love is not a program, not a political party, not a race. It is a promise with a power all its own. The contributions of Martin and me, and of those behind and before us, are the great witnesses I can imagine to the power of love in action. The dream is a work that is very much in progress. I am counting on the next generation.